Hey, everybody, welcome to this conversation. I'm Reverend Jim Keat, the digital minister at the Riverside Church and the director of online innovation at Convergence. And I'm joined with Jay Kranda, who is in Southern California. Where's it at? I have actually words about you here on my screen somewhere. Jay is the online community pastor at Saddleback Church, and he has over a decade experience. I think, almost 15 years, if I counted the math
Very
correctly.
close, very close. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll round up to 15. A decade and a half as an online pastor at Saddleback. So those things are interesting. He is one of the longest serving online pastors, probably in the world, at one of the largest churches in the world. What a fun combination. Jay, thanks for hanging out on the Zoom with us today.
No, thanks for having me. I'm excited to jump in. I was very grateful when you reached out to me. I know we've connected and I stay engaged in with what you're doing. And yeah, I'm excited. Writing a book is a quite a chore and task. And so any chance I get to engage it, and I'm curious how you receive some of the thoughts. And so I'm excited to jump in.
We'll see what we can do. So the book, for anyone who is unaware, it's called "Online Church is Not the Answer." Beyond just streaming to hybrid disciple making, you can buy it wherever you buy books. So go ahead and make that happen. But Jay, I have a handful of questions we'll dive into. But just to start, can you just talk about who this book is for and what are you hoping that they would take away from this?
Yeah, so when I started in online ministry, I came to faith at a smaller church in high school, and then I found myself at one of the largest churches in the world interning, and then it led to a job opportunity. And they had this thing called the Internet Campus that nobody was doing anything with at the time. Our church is kind of notorious for starting and kind of moving on and messing around. And I was
Just
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 very,
your church? I thought
I
that
know
was
every
that was
church. I think most churches are that way. Uh, we tend to be. I do think there are some churches that are more teaching churches in the sense that they're like a teaching hospital, and so we're kind of sometimes I feel very extreme in it because we're always like, and then we're helping, and then it's like, well, we're not even doing that well anymore. Like, why are we still helping? And so, but that all to say, I realized very early on that I had this extreme luxury to do online ministry for a good part of my job. And then 2013, it led to a full-time role. And I knew what it meant being at a church like under 500 people where like you're just trying to like keep the doors open and it kind of felt like I got this over 10 plus years a doctorate in digital ministry and I had spoke at conferences, I had worked with churches of all sizes around the world, had traveled a lot helping ministries, and I just wanted to provide something kind of like a here's 15 bucks, here's everything I know to kind of help the average church leader think about digital, because I think it's kind of we have these extremes where people are fully digital, VR chat, doing all this crazy stuff, where people are very like anti-digital. We're going to go the complete other way. And I just really believe part of that title is that I don't think the future is this fully digital thing, even though I think there's some really cool stuff happening there. I think the average church, I just want you to think about leveraging technology and digital in a way that can help your objectives. And I have some tools and things in there to go like, okay, the weekend is great. So like COVID, for example, a lot of churches embraced digital during COVID, but they never really did anything else with it. And
Mm.
my hope with this book is just to help the average church leader think about digital in a very practical way that can aid in what you're doing. And so I wrote it for churches of all sizes. I wrote it for volunteers, for pastors. I tried to be as neutral as I could on a lot of these things so that anybody could read it. I really, lack of a better word, I do mean that. Like it's meant to be like, here's a degree program and how I think about digital, and you could just go through it in a couple hours, and that's my hope.
Great. That's fantastic. I mean, and I think we need those reminders to be more intentional about how we engage digital everything in our all of life, but particularly our ministerial capacities. I've
Yep.
said dozens of times that, COVID threw the world into digital spaces, many of us for the first time in new ways, churches especially. And I think so many churches just saw the digital capacities and capabilities we developed throughout the peak pandemic, especially as a band-aid that was just a temporary thing. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Those are new muscles. You got to keep
I love
flexing
that.
and
Yeah.
stretching those. And I feel like a book like this is just one of those helpful ways of saying that wasn't just a moment, it wasn't just a blip.
Mhm.
It's an intentional strategy that can and probably should be incorporated into all of what you do in ministry. That's great. That's great. So one of my things I noticed in the book, which was really fascinating, because this also gives a bit of like a, biographical, I get to know Saddleback's journey. I get to know
Yeah.
your journey, which was really fascinating. And one thing I want to touch on, you talked about the change from calling it even online campuses to online community. And your title, is a pastor, online community pastor. So can you say a bit more about that shift? It might seem like a subtle thing, but I think there's a big implication to go from online campus to online community. Why that shift? What's the meaning of that nomenclature?
Yeah, so like, at a high level, your digital strategy is obviously coming out of biblical convictions of what the church is and why we're left here on earth to continue, spreading the gospel. But and then also you sit under your leadership's vision, depending on how that's structured, or multiple leaders, one leader, whatever. For our church, one of the things is I knew very early on, especially our founding pastor, Pastor Rick Warren, he was very much a local church person, and he had a lot of these convictions around even doing stuff online. And I talk about that in the book. And Pastor Rick was actually super kind. He gave me he emailed me a lot of history that I was able to include in the first couple of chapters. But one of those things was in our conviction, we don't want people to be solely digital online. Now, I say that in our conviction because I think some of these conversations, people can argue with me, these might be secondary, third level theological convictions that I'm not going to, I would say we're within the kingdom and we're going to disagree and so forth. And I have friends, trust me, when I wrote this book, I have friends that I was very worried that I might lose because I'm an advocate for a lot of the digital only stuff in some ways. I see them as missionaries. But in our conviction, we strategically moved away using the word campus because we have multiple campuses. We have over like 18 campuses around the world. And we use that word, that means physical expressions of our church. And when we had an online campus early on, as we were experimenting, I felt, and then as I made the argument and wrestled through with our elders and our leadership, I was like, I don't think campus is fair because I don't want somebody joining online thinking they're at their destination.
Hmm.
And and so I made the argument, what if we move away from campus language to online community? So instead of me being the online campus pastor, I'm the online community pastor. And the idea is the online community is a collective of people near and far away. You're engaging because maybe you're sick or you're traveling or you're new. And then our job, the online community's job, is to get you connected to physical community over the next week, months, years. And we have stages to that. And then technically, and this is where, there's some rabbit trails here, but one of the things in our strategy, and I make this case, every church has to wrestle through this in their own way. But in our case, if you're far away, there's two options, meaning far away from one of our campuses. We make the case that you start a house church in your home or in your city, which we call extensions, or we help you get plugged into another church. Now, I say that's very loaded because there are a lot of people online is the only option for a season or for a long period. Like people really underestimate people like I call it that it's like the seasons of life, sickness, security. Like people are maybe you're a new parent and somehow you found yourself thinking about God again. You're going like you might not just with sleep schedules be able to do it. You might be somebody that's sick with an actual illness. A lot of people don't think about there's a huge population of elderly that can't go to church and their local parish or church doesn't know how to support them. And online is the only option, honestly, in a lot of those cases. And then lastly, security. And this is something that I've been uniquely I I've made probably 8 or 12 trips to the Middle East over the last 10 years and I've worked with churches in a lot of these closed countries, and I've seen why online might be one of the key options to
Hmm.
providing community. And so I say that like in the US or in Canada or wherever you're at, we kind of forget that we have this luxury of building and publicly gathering, and that's not always the case. And so again, it's thinking about it for us. We don't want people only engaging online in our local church's strategy and thinking it's a destination. And so we moved away from campus to community. Now, this is a small change to some people watching this, but it made sense for our strategy, our vision for what we're doing as local church. And I would encourage any church to wrestle through that at a high level. Language is important. It does frame things.
Yeah, that's what I really picked up on in it is how, the words we use are often suitcases that contain a whole lot of ideas within them. It's a simple phrase that has a lot of meaning. And I think like you just said, the intentional strategic shift contextual to Saddleback of campus means this thing, and so we don't want people to get confused by that. And I just think it's helpful because suddenly now I can be a part of the online community regardless of what campus I go to. It's not like, oh, I have to choose online campus or, whatever this campus in this part of town. It's like, no, online community is a broader umbrella term. So I think the nomenclature we use, the words we use, help cast the vision for what we're trying to do. They being intentional, even about what you're calling the thing you're doing, is an intentional act that has ramifications
Agreed.
across so many things. And I just think even the evolution of it. Think about it. Like, a lot of online church stuff came out of big, mostly evangelical churches from the 90s and 2000s, where campuses, multi-campus sites was a thing. So you'd have like, we have all these campuses. What's an online campus? So that just was kind of default language inherited. And now we're able to say, let's kind of evaluate some of that word use and how does it fit with where we are and what could or should it be. So I think
And
that's all really, really
and
great.
that's part of my it's a little bit of a I'm doing a little bit of a marketing tactic here with my title, but part of it is it got very popular to say church online, and a lot of churches all they did was launch a streaming thing. And so
Yeah.
my argument in the book is that church is much more than your weekend.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think it's like, just because you have a stream that starts and stops doesn't mean you have church online. Now, I understand the evolution that and how that came about, but I'm trying to, and I think unintentionally what happens is that people copy influencers, big churches. A lot of, people want to copy our church's strategy. And I would go, we are a unique, terrible word, beast. But like, it's for us, it's like we have a strategy because of our size, our mission, our vision. But your local church probably doesn't need to copy us. You need to think about it differently. And so this is why I'm trying to get at the heart of it. Like, think beyond just your weekend streaming, the church online platform, some of these things that people are doing. Again, this is why there's this blessing and curse thing that happens with new technology. So like, the blessing of a building is you get to publicly gather. The curse is that the building, people think church is only in the building. And so the same thing is when Zuckerberg launches streaming to every church for free in like 2013, 14, everybody's like, this is free. This is amazing. I could just turn on a stream. The curse is their online digital strategy is just streaming, and they don't really
Yeah.
think anymore. So you have to wrestle through that.
Yeah, which I think is a point you make really well of, it's like, that's the hint of the book. You're not against live streaming your Sunday morning gatherings and services. You're for saying that just like any church, whether you have pre-internet back in the 80s, church was more than just sitting in a pew for an hour. At least we hoped it would have been.
Yeah.
So the same principles apply here. Church is more than just having a live stream with one or 100 cameras. Church should be the way people connect and gather and engage. And the live stream might be a part of that. That might be a component to that strategy, but it's not the end all to the strategy, which is another thing I want to bring up. You have well, one of your takeaways from a chapter. You say our job isn't to fill a room, but to help produce fruit in people's lives. And this was a part of a chapter where part of it was this question of, is live streaming a threat to the on-site gathering, which a lot of people have that threat. If we live stream, no one's going to show up, which kind of exposes the wrong objective people have, as if the goal of church is to get people to show up. Uh, so can you unpack that a bit more? How live streaming might be a threat to people showing up in the room? I don't think it really is as much as people
Yeah.
worry it is, but it's not a threat to the actual objectives of producing fruit in people's lives.
Yeah, and first, there's a lot of research. I think Ryan Berg just came out with a study. He broke down a Pew Research study about how, a lot of people watching online are also showing up in person. They just see it as a feature to be part of your church. It's not really like competitive. And so like a lot of that, I think at a whole, like, it's not hurting your attendance. But for sure, I kind of jokingly tell this story, but it's true. Like, when I was offered the job as the online campus pastor at that time in 2013, I was told by a good friend of mine and a mentor, like, this job isn't going to be around, pretty much because like leadership thinks this is hurting our church.
Mm,
And they said, you might only have it for a year. And now my friend he was saying it in a very like wise way. He wasn't saying don't take it, but I still remember that. And I still
yeah.
joke with him today because he's still on staff and we joke about it. But yeah, so like my conviction here is that our objective is to produce spiritual fruit in people's lives. Our objective isn't to fill a room. And I say that like jokingly, but um, pastors, church leaders, we mimic what we're modeled. And so, like, you go to seminary in a physical room, when you get trained, like I made this joke at one point that like, like, there's this like, how do you teach people? You just like, how do you solve racism in America? Get people in a room and talk about it. How do you solve this? And you get people in a room and talk about it. And the model is we gather to talk about it. And I think my point in the book is that gather format is not the actual objective. The objective is to change something in someone's life. It's to produce this fruit of the spirit, for example. And so like I use this example of like in the book of we did this big parents event. We wanted to encourage parents at our church, and we did this big event on Saturday morning, and the event kind of totally crashed. And I think the idea is we're asking people to come on Sunday morning, be part of a small group, be in a ministry. On top of they have kids, soccer event. Like I have 3 days a week right now. My middle kid is in soccer, and 3 days a week is dedicated in the evenings to soccer, and it's hard. And the thought was, if we want to encourage parents or help them be better biblical parents, maybe that event to gather was the wrong way to do it. Maybe the objective, in this case, it was actually a podcast. What if we just did a monthly podcast they can listen to? Now, the podcast I know is very popular right now format, but I think again, it's not about just getting people in a room. And so I think I would ask, like, there's a lot of church leaders, if you think about what is your actual objective, and yes, you might have a gather deliverable, but maybe there is a digital component. Maybe it's creating a WhatsApp group. Maybe it's a YouTube thing or a podcast, or maybe it's a texting strategy. And I really encourage, like, it's not just to get people in the room. And I think churches are fighting for that because I think sometimes it's like we want to preserve something out of fear. And I would go, I don't think that that's ever going away. I don't think, I use the illustration that like my wife and I are doing community together and doing life together. We text and interact all throughout our day, but we come home together. We have a geo proximity based relationship. And I don't care. I don't care how great, the Orion, Meta new device, or like, the Apple Pro Vision is. We're still always going to do that. And I think that will be here in 1,000 years from now. And so I just make that argument. The objective is to produce fruit, not to gather. And I do think, though, there are things we still gather for, but I think there are a lot of secondary things that maybe digital can actually do a little bit better depending on what you're trying to produce.
I mean, I'm going to borrow that language time and time again, and I hope we all do, because it helps us reorient what the objective is, what the actual goal and priority is, and we get so fixated on butts and seats. And
Yeah.
I think the subtext to that is often, well, people in the room are more likely to put money in the offering plate, which is there's legitimacy
Yeah.
there, which maybe is another conversation we should talk about at some time. But that's a different kind of fear also. Like, so suddenly you're driving your objectives based on, well, the bottom line is the budget, and if we don't get people in the room, we're not going to meet the budget. It's like, is that what the church exists for? Maybe we need to have some bigger
Yeah.
picture evaluations if that's really the fear that is driving a lot of our decision making versus what you're saying. So I love everything you're echoing there. Yeah. Now, churches are all different. You know this, I know this. You and I are at two slightly different churches, I would even say,
Yeah.
Saddleback and Riverside, on two opposite sides of the country. Both doing incredible things, but having a slight different maybe posture at times. And I think it's probably safe to say everyone watching live on Zoom, and probably even the recording from my network, might be a little different than most of your typical network of people. This is probably a lot more liberal Protestant mainline folk that I'm hanging out with here in my camp. So hey, good to hang out. But I'm curious, from your side of things, just perspective on church at large and digital specifically, how would you articulate the difference between the ways evangelical churches and Protestant mainline churches engage digital? And given your context, what do you think that Protestant mainline churches could learn or borrow from our evangelical cousins?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, typically evangelical, especially like if I lean a little larger, we tend to be more liberal in the experimenting side of things. Like we tend to be very aggressive in trying new tech. And for the sake, again, it comes out of that word, like, evangelistic. Like we'll do anything, Craig Rochelle has that famous saying, "I'll do anything short of sin to lead you to Jesus." And I think a lot of evangelical big churches kind of come from that let's grow, let's grow, let's grow. And I think that comes from um, that I think naturally leans into using new technology very easily in a lot of cases. And then I think I think that, experiment. I kind of unpack this idea that, this is very famously that your iPhone, for example, gets better every month with new software upgrades. And, there's a lot with your digital strategy at your church that won't make sense, doesn't make sense. And it's one of the reasons why I still love being a pastor at my church, because I have not arrived, and I don't think I will ever arrive on this. I think it becomes less foggy and more clear. But so I think from the evangelical world, I think generally it's just using new technology a little bit more aggressively. And I mean that in a very broad sense. It could be tools, platforms. We're less scared generally of some of these social platforms and so forth. Now, I say that there are some extreme ends that are very that might be scared of TikTok because of China's influence, and that's on a political spectrum. That's another extreme of the evangelical world. And then yeah, and then I would just say on the other flip side, I think I think for most part, you guys, I say that in a very broad sense. I think there's a good sense of holding true to what your mission is. And what I mean by that is I think it's this slippery slope on both ends where you can be so rigid that you don't try anything or you try too much. And I'm
Mm,
usually, because I have friends and I've worked with churches in all sorts of places, I'm always like, you got to be who you are and you got to figure out what to lean into and what not to lean into. So it's, I kind of make the case over and over again that it's not about whatever's popular. It's about what makes sense for the people you're reaching. And
yeah.
so there are tools that I use because of my demographic and where I'm going. And there's tools you're going to use that I'm not going to use. And so I have this example, like I was doing some work with some really cool ministries doing stuff around Iran and some of the countries in Turkey and so forth, where a lot of displaced people have gone. I'm leaving that scenario. And they're using Telegram and Signal to a huge degree because of some of the security features, or at least so-called security features. It seems like Telegram and some of those have gotten a little looser on that stuff. But um, and the average, American church leader doesn't know what Telegram is, doesn't
Yeah.
know what Signal is. And I say that like the point is they don't need to be on Instagram and Facebook and all this. They need to be on Telegram because that's how they can do groups. The same ways there's a lot of people in the US don't know WhatsApp. It's changing in the last year, but WhatsApp is this very dominant platform outside the US and it's growing here. But what I say is that I think just you need to be super focused on your mission. And the problem with digital, the same way, with fighting online, there's so much noise happening online and people telling you places to go and things to use that you can you forget what you're trying to do. And
Yeah.
so, and I really respect that with a lot of, on the counter of on the evangelical, if you, evangelical, we tend to be a little bit too change dependent. We're always chasing something cool.
Mm.
And there's good and bad about that. On the flip side, I like the staying on mission. And so, yeah, but yeah, I would, do you have any thoughts on that? I would be curious if you,
I mean, I think I like a lot of what you said, how the evangelical side is a little more open to embracing and experimenting new technology. And I think part of that is, like you've said in some of this and some of the subtext is a lot of the evangelical drive is this like bring you to Jesus
yeah,
evangelism. So a lot of times these online tools and platforms and digital things are new frontiers for evangelism. And I think that's a conversation that the mainline church needs to engage and have too. What does evangelism mean for us? We sometimes we cringe at that word, and I think we need to reclaim it too.
yeah,
And like I have seen far too often that in mainline churches we're so focused on like, well, we gotta run the food pantry and help people with this. I don't have the budget to spend on those things because
yeah,
this is more important than this. Like, yeah,
yep,
which again is kind of a missional alignment decision. So
yep,
the question is always how do we hold those appropriately? And I think the biggest thing is being true to who you are, as a community, as a person of faith, so that you're not just like diving into the toys because Jay said it's cool, but it's like
correct.
how does this actually align with who I am and my vision of things? Yeah,
Mm,
I mean, yeah, I personally, I remember meeting Andy Root, who's at Luther Seminary and talks about incarnational theology a lot.
mm,
And I read that in a youth ministry setting when I was a youth pastor at a big progressive mega church in West Michigan. but just that sense of place sharing and being an incarnational presence. And I think that's one thing I think that all churches, but I think the mainline is really leaning into well, because we've always done a good job of trying to be with people. Not that evangelical churches haven't,
No, that
but
makes
a
sense.
lot of times mainliners are just like, we're going to meet the needs of our community in very tangible ways. And our focus isn't on growth in the same capacity for
Mhm.
whatever reason, cultural shifts. So I think I hope all churches, but mainliners, I think, have a really maybe just DNA that can allow us to see online spaces as just a place for an incarnational presence, which is a slightly different tone than seeing it as a frontier for evangelism. There's an overlap probably, but it's a little
Well,
different
and I've
posture at
noticed
times.
too a lot of times, and this is a general sense because I know they're not all, when you say mainline, they can mean all sorts of things. But I also know like because of the autonomy in a lot of the evangelical churches, I can make a
Yeah.
decision in my church very quickly.
Yes.
Where it's in a lot of mainline denominations, there it has to come from a higher up or has to be so. Like for example, if I want to make a change in this denomination or this mainline church, I might have to start higher up and convince them, and then they would decentralize the training and the resource, and that's just a structural thing. And so that's just
Yep.
like when we
Yep.
have a lack of a better word, our churches function a lot of times just as a CEO model,
Yep.
with a, we have an elder board and a trustee board and so forth, but it's just like that just change is going to move a little slower. But
Yeah.
it might move in some cases really good slow. And so I mean there's give and takes on structure.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so, so true. And change takes time, especially the bigger the system,
Yep.
which can be good or can be bad, and that's a lot of it. So, and I also want to shout out too, as much as the main line can often get cast as the frozen chosen. I know there are definitely some incredible progressive liberal mainline pastors who I've seen just go all in on what
Mhm.
these digital capacities can be. I'm pretty sure right now on this webinar, a guy named Rev Timoth is with us, who, if you're not all following Timoth on TikTok, he continues to create amazing spaces there.
Mhm.
But it's been really fun to see like progressive clergy as a hashtag emerge on some digital platforms, whereas maybe that's not always the spaces that clergy show up for these different purposes. But it's I think there's a lot to learn on both sides, and my biggest hope is that that can be an ongoing dialogue and never a you have to do it our way or you're doing it wrong. But how can
Mhm.
we all take the best, integrate it into our context and our setting, for the sake of making the world hopefully a little bit better as a result? All right. I have one last thing to do, Jay, before we wrap up.
Yeah.
We're gonna play a game because
Uh-oh.
why not? Yeah. All right. Let me get this set up here on my side. There we go. Buttons, buttons. All right. The most important thing we can do in our time today is play a game called the emoji. So I'm going to show you a slide that has some
Oh.
emoji, and you have to tell me what Bible story is it telling. This is the true test
Oh.
of if you're an online internet community campus digital pastor.
Oh man. I'm scared. This is like, like I always get afraid I'm gonna forget some basic Bible story and then, you can make a joke. That's why I'm an online pastor. You know
Yeah,
what I
there we
mean?
go.
Yeah.
All
Okay.
right. The emoji number one. We're gonna do three. And anyone in the chat, you can try to chime in too. Jay, no looking at the chat until you've committed to your answer. So here's the first one.
Um, okay. So smoke, fire, I
Or wind, perhaps that might be.
wind,
Notice where the fire is located.
second. I mean,
Well,
I'm torn because I'm like fire and baptism, and then I'm like, no, the coming of the Spirit. I'm like the King. So construction worker, or is this Jesus being born?
this is Pentecost.
It is
This is
Pentecost.
the
This
wind
is
blowing
so
through, the
hard. Oh
tongues of
man.
fire on their heads, and they're baptized from many
Oh, I
nations. So I have,
see. That is
yeah, yeah,
awesome.
yeah. I'm getting very
It's
literal.
Pentecost.
Okay, that's good. That was
Okay.
good. You were there. You were there. Anyone in the chat
Literal.
get it? I'm not paying attention to the chat right now. All right, here we go. Number two. We're doing three of these. Number two. Now
Okay.
this is a slightly
Oh,
deep cut in the
let's
Hebrew scriptures.
see. Oh, is this is this isn't like David killing um the bear? Bear dead. Is this Samson?
No, this is Elisha when the three teenagers, the
Oh,
wily youths, made fun of him for being bald, and so
oh yeah, and then
naturally
he
he
attacked.
sends two bears to go kill them
I
because,
want this to be clipped right here. I just want this to be clipped.
Okay, last one, grand finale. Here we go. The emoji, 3 of 3.
Okay. Oh my goodness. This looks like the seraphim, like like that's what it looks like. Crossing the river. Is this oh,
This
is it
is
no
my well, okay, the numbers matter. So
no is it
there's
Noah's flood? Yeah.
this.
Is it
There we go. There we go.
yeah,
So
yeah,
this
yeah.
is the more accurate version because technically we think of it as 2 by 2, but the story tells us there were 7 of each clean animal and then 2 of the unclean
Oh,
animal. So that's why
interesting.
there's more sheep and deer and doves, but only two
That's a
pigs.
deep. I like that. That's a nerdy version of it. I like that. I like that a lot. That's like oh anyways, my brain is now I love that. That's awesome.
I just think it's way too much fun, and the seminary geek in me still wants to keep playing games
Yeah,
like that. So,
clearly.
well, biggest thing I want to tell everybody, you should definitely check out this book. There are not enough books on digital ministry out there.
Mm.
There's a handful. I got a lot of them on my shelf back here because I'm collecting them from when all you all write them and my friends write them. But we need more. So digital ministry is not going away. I'm guessing most of us probably did not have any classes on this in any sort of seminary or theological training we had. That's changing now. There are some that exist, and it's happening more and more. But still, it's like an elective. It's a component, and we need just more conversations, more bodies of work, more content to allow us to learn from one another, have the best practices. I think of this as often as like the invention of youth ministry in the '60s. It was just like a thing that was starting post World War II. And now it's like a whole structure and system with giant publishing companies, and that's a whole other conversation. But we're at the beginning in many ways still. So Jay, I'm grateful that you are a voice in this conversation at this stage, and everyone watching and listening, grateful that you are as well. Be sure to check out Jay's book. Jay, where can they go? Where are you online? jkranda.com. What's the
Yeah,
best place? Yep, there it is.
jcrandon.com. You could check it out on Amazon and Apple and all that. I saw some team bundles too on the website if you want to buy it and go through your whole team. And I did try to write it so that you could go through it. It's for anybody at the church that's doing ministry. So
It's fantastic. It's fantastic. All right, more to come. Everyone in the world, go play some Theomoji, talk to someone you love, text someone, say hello, and keep doing all the great stuff you're doing. We'll talk to you all on the next one. Bye, everyone.